There I stood, staring at the nurse holding out a clipboard, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. "We just need Mrs. Caldwell's signature on these admission forms," she said cheerfully, completely unaware that the simple request had turned my blood to ice. I glanced at my mother-in-law Vivian, who sat slumped in the wheelchair, her eyes vacant, her breathing labored. My mouth went dry as I realized this was the moment I'd been dreading for months. How could I possibly explain that this woman, who my husband believed was his loving mother, had been forging my signature on financial documents for years, or that, 3 days ago, I'd discovered she had somehow become the sole beneficiary of my husband's $750,000 life insurance policy, the same husband who was away on a business trip, completely unaware of what was happening in this sterile, fluorescent-lit emergency room. "Ma'am," the nurse's voice pulled me back to reality. "Is everything okay?" No, nothing was okay. But as I looked down at Vivian's trembling hands, I noticed something that made my skin crawl: her fingernails. Those perfectly manicured nails, with the distinctive burgundy polish I'd always admired, were now stained with ink. The same color ink as the pen I kept in my home office, where I stored all our important financial documents. And suddenly, I knew this hospital visit wasn't what it seemed. I wasn't helping a sick woman get medical care. I was standing at the edge of something dark and dangerous, a web I'd been caught in without even knowing it existed. "She can't sign these," I finally managed to whisper, surprising myself with my own words. The nurse raised her eyebrows, confused. "She's been forging signatures." The words tumbled out before I could stop them, quiet enough that only the nurse could hear. Vivian's head snapped up at that moment, her previously weak posture suddenly rigid, her eyes no longer vacant but sharp and cold as they locked onto mine. And in that split second of unguarded truth between us, I saw something I would never forget. Not confusion or hurt, but pure, calculated rage. When Richard and I first married 15 years ago, I thought I'd hit the jackpot in the mother-in-law department. Vivian Caldwell was everything my own mother wasn't: elegant, composed, and seemingly supportive of our relationship. "You're the daughter I never had, Elizabeth," she told me at our wedding reception, her voice warm as she pressed her cool cheek against mine. The scent of her signature perfume, something expensive with notes of jasmine and amber, enveloped me as she whispered, "Family takes care of family. That's the Caldwell way." I would come to realize much later how those words weren't a warm welcome, they were a warning, a mantra she would use to justify everything that followed. We saw Vivian regularly in those early years. She lived about 40 minutes away in the same upscale neighborhood where Richard had grown up, in a beautiful colonial-style home that she maintained meticulously after her husband passed away. When Richard was in college, Sunday dinners became our tradition, and I'd watch with a mixture of admiration and mild intimidation as she effortlessly prepared elaborate meals while maintaining her perfect appearance, not a gray hair out of place, her makeup subtle but flawless, her clothes expensive but never flashy. "Presentation matters, Elizabeth," she'd say, adjusting my collar or suggesting a different lipstick shade. "First impressions last forever." She was always helping me become better, more polished, more worthy of her son. Richard adored his mother, and who could blame him? She had raised him alone after his father died, putting him through the best schools, supporting his every ambition. "Mom sacrificed everything for me," he would say with such reverence that I never questioned it. And for a long time, I believed Vivian truly cared for me too. She remembered my birthday with thoughtful gifts always, something I'd mentioned wanting months earlier, proving she listened. She recommended me for committees at her country club, introduced me to her influential friends. When we struggled with infertility for 3 painful years, she held my hand through failed treatments and disappointments, never once joining the chorus of voices asking when we would make her a grandmother. The first hairline fracture in our relationship appeared 7 years ago, when Richard received a significant promotion at the financial consulting firm where he worked. It meant more money, more prestige, and much more travel. "You'll be alone so much," Vivian said during a private moment at our celebration dinner, her hand resting sympathetically on mine. "Why don't I come stay with you when Richard is away? No one should rattle around in that big house by themselves." The offer seemed generous, but something in her tone made me hesitate. Still, Richard thought it was a wonderful idea. "Mom's getting older," he said later that night, It would be good for both of you. And so began a new chapter in our lives. With Vivian staying at our home sometimes for weeks at a stretch while Richard traveled for work. Looking back now, I can pinpoint that as the moment everything began to change slowly, imperceptibly at first. Like poison administered one drop at a time, Vivian's visits grew longer and more frequent. She began rearranging things in my kitchen, explaining that her system was more efficient. She redecorated the guest room without asking, turning it into a permanent space for herself filled with her own furniture from home. "I've downsized my place," she announced one day. "At my age, it makes sense to prepare for the future." Richard was thrilled that his mother was becoming a more permanent fixture in our lives. I tried to be understanding after all. She was in her late 60s then, and the idea of aging alone can be frightening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about how quickly she was integrating herself into the fabric of our marriage. When I took her to her doctor's appointment on that fateful Tuesday morning, I had no idea that by nightfall, everything I thought I knew about my life would be appended. Vivian had called me the previous evening, her voice shaking. "I don't feel well, Elizabeth. My chest, there's a pressure. And my left arm feels strange." My heart had jumped immediately to the worst. Conclusion: heart attack symptoms. "I'm coming over right now," I said, already reaching for my car keys. "We should go to the ER, but Vivian refused. No, I have my regular checkup tomorrow morning. Just take me to that. I don't want to be dramatic." Against my better judgment, I agreed to wait. That night, I barely slept, checking my phone constantly in case she called again. By morning, when I picked her up at 8 a.m. sharp, she seemed better tired, moving slowly, but not in acute distress. "See, just an anxiety spell," she said as I helped her into my car. I noticed she brought an unusually large purse with her, clutching it tightly on her lap. "Are you sure you don't want to go to the emergency room instead?" I asked, still worried. She patted my hand with that condescending smile she'd perfected over the years. "My doctor knows me best, dear. Now hurry, we don't want to be late." So I drove her to the medical center across town, the same office she'd been visiting for years, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. When we arrived at the doctor's office, something strange happened. Rather than checking in at her usual primary care physician's suite on the third floor, Vivian directed me to take her to a different wing of the building, the cardiology department. "Dr. Matthews referred me," she explained when I looked confused. After I called about my symptoms, it made sense, so I didn't question it further. I helped her check in, then settled into the waiting room with a magazine while she was called back. 45 minutes later, instead of Vivian returning to the waiting room, a nurse approached me. "Mrs. Caldwell is requesting that you join her," she said. "The doctor wants to discuss some concerns." The cardiologist, Dr. Patel, was a serious-looking man with kind eyes. He explained that based on Vivian's symptoms and some concerning results from her EKG, he wanted to admit her to the hospital for observation and additional tests. "We don't want to take chances with potential cardiac events at Mrs. Caldwell's age," he said. Vivian looked pale and small in the examination chair, suddenly every bit her 72 years. "I'll need to call Richard," I said, reaching for my phone. Vivian's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping my wrist. "Don't bother him yet," she insisted. "He's in the middle of that important client meeting in Chicago. Let's wait until we know something definite." The doctor gave me the admission paperwork, and I drove Vivian to the hospital connected to the medical center, still clutching that oversized purse to her chest. And that's how I ended up standing in the emergency room intake area, watching a nurse ask my mother-in-law for a signature while my entire world tilted on its axis. Because 3 days earlier, while looking for a postage stamp in Vivian's desk drawer with her permission, while she was out getting her hair done, I had found a folder labeled Richard Important tucked beneath some stationery. I hadn't meant to snoop, but Richard's name caught my attention. Inside were financial documents I'd never seen before. A life insurance policy showing Vivian as the sole beneficiary, changed from my name just 6 months earlier. Bank account statements for accounts I didn't know existed. And most disturbingly, 3 credit cards in my name that I had never applied for, with statements showing charges totaling over $42,000 in the past year alone. My head had spun as I flipped through the papers. There was a copy of our mortgage document with what looked like my signature, but I had no memory of signing it. Same for papers regarding a home equity line of credit taken out against our house. Just 2 months ago for $175,000. The signature looked like mine. But the handwriting had subtle differences. Only I would notice the way the Z in Elizabeth was formed, the slight tremor in the B that I never had. As my shock turned to panic, I noticed something else. A small notepad beside the folder with pages of practice signatures, my signature, repeated dozens of times with increasing accuracy. I had quickly taken photos of everything with my phone, then placed the documents back exactly as I'd found them, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. I hadn't confronted Vivian, yet what would I even say? And Richard was in the middle of a critical business trip. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do. But now, watching Vivian's face transform from weak patient to something predatory as the nurse waited for her signature, I realized time had run out. Whatever game Vivian was playing, it was reaching some kind of climax. And the hospital paperwork was part of it somehow. I could feel it in the sudden tension crackling between us. The nurse looked from me to Vivian and back again, clearly sensing that something was wrong. Perhaps we should speak privately, she suggested, her professional demeanor intact but her eyes sharp. With concern, Vivian straightened up even more in her wheelchair. There's no need for privacy from family, she said, her voice suddenly stronger than it had been all day. Elizabeth is just overwrought. She's been under such stress lately, mental health issues, you know. She tapped her temple meaningfully, and my blood ran cold at how easily she tried to discredit me. The nurse, whose name badge read Angela, didn't seem convinced. Standard protocol, she said firmly. Let's step over here. Ma'am, she guided me a few feet away, just out of Vivian's earshot. Is there something I should know about this situation? She asked quietly. My mind raced. If I told her everything now, what would happen? Would anyone even believe me? I had no proof with Mitha. Photos were on my phone at home, charging on my nightstand where I'd accidentally left it in my rush to pick up Vivian that morning. She's been manipulating financial documents, I whispered. And I think this hospital visit might be part of something bigger. I don't think she's actually sick. Angela's professionalism never wavered, but her eyes widened slightly. That's a serious concern, she said. But right now, we have to address her medical situation first. Her EKG does show some irregularities that need monitoring. She hesitated, then added, however, if you have concerns about elder exploitation or financial matters, we have a patient advocate who can help navigate those waters. She glanced back at Vivian, who was watching us intently. For now, would you feel comfortable signing the admission forms as her caretaker? It just acknowledges that you brought her in. I nodded, taking the clipboard with trembling hands. As I signed my actual signature, how strange that something so ordinary now felt so significant. I asked, is there any way to make sure she doesn't leave on her own? I need to go home and get some documentation. Angela seemed to understand the subtext. We'll be monitoring her closely for the next 24 hours, at minimum, she assured me. Cardiac observation patients don't just walk out. She lowered her voice even further. And I'll make a note in the system about your concerns. I felt a rush of gratitude for this stranger who was taking me seriously when my own family might not. As Angela wheeled Vivian away for admission, my mother-in-law turned to look at me one last time. The mask of illness had completely fallen away, replaced by a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. Don't forget to pick up my prescription on your way back, she called out, loud enough for others to hear, maintaining the appearance of a dutiful daughter-in-law errand. But the message in her eyes was clear. This was a test, and she was watching to see what I would do next. I nodded automatically, the perfect obedient daughter-in-law I'd been for 15 years. But inside, for the first time, I felt something new and unfamiliar, taking root, not fear or confusion, but anger, pure, clarifying anger that burned away my uncertainty. I walked out of that hospital with my shoulders straight and my mind racing. I knew I had perhaps hours, at most, before Vivian found a way to contact Richard or implement whatever plan she had been setting in motion. The drive home felt surreal, the familiar streets of our suburb looking somehow different, as if I was seeing them through new eyes. Our house, the beautiful two-story colonial that Richard and I had purchased 10 years ago, loomed ahead, no longer simply our home but a crime scene of sorts. How many documents had been forged at our dining room table? How many calls made from our landline to set up fraudulent accounts? I'll show you exactly what I found when I finally started paying attention, and how deep the deception went. But first, I needed to gather evidence. My hands were still shaking as I unlocked our front door. The house was quiet, too quiet without Vivian's constant presence, her humming as she rearranged my belongings, her cooking shows playing on the kitchen television. I headed straight for my phone, still plugged in beside our bed. 3 missed calls from Richard unusual during his workday. My stomach clenched as I listened to his voicemail. "Hey honey, just checking in. Mom called me a little worried about you, said you've been acting strange lately. Call me when you can." My blood ran cold. Vivian had already started laying groundwork, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. How long had she been doing this? What else had she told him that I didn't know about? I pushed aside my panic and focused on the task at hand. Opening my photos, I found the evidence I'd hastily captured, the insurance policy showing the beneficiary change dated January 15th of that year, the credit card statements with purchases at stores I'd never visited, the home equity line of credit documentation with its $175,000 withdrawal, made just 2 weeks earlier. Where had that money gone? Looking more closely at the credit card statements, I noticed a pattern: high-end, department stores, jewelry purchases, restaurant charges in Tampa, Florida, where, if I remembered correctly, Vivian's sister lived. The largest charge was at a place called Bayshore Retirement Properties for a deposit of $15,000 dated 3 months earlier. With growing horror, I realized what might be happening. Was Vivian using our money, using my identity to set herself up for retirement? But why the elaborate scheme? Richard would have helped his mother if she needed financial assistance. He adored her, unless the amounts involved were far more than what could be explained as normal family support. I needed to dig deeper, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I grabbed a notepad and began making a timeline of suspicious activities, starting with when Vivian began staying with us regularly after Richard's promotion. I wrote down every unusual financial event I could. Remembered the time our mortgage payment was mysteriously taken care of when I thought we might be late. The investment decisions Richard mentioned that I had no recollection of discussing. The time Vivian helped reorganize our home office while I was visiting my sister for a week. As I worked, I remembered something else: the spare key to Vivian's house that we kept in our key drawer. I had access to her home just as she had access to ours. If she was keeping evidence of her activities at our house, might there be more information at hers? The thought of entering her home to search for evidence made my stomach churn, but I was beginning to understand that I was fighting for my financial survival, possibly for my marriage as well. I'm going to tell you about what I found at Vivian's house later, and believe me, it will make your skin crawl just like it did mine. But first, I needed expert help. I thought about who I could trust with something this delicate and potentially explosive. Not Richard's friends, they all knew and loved Vivian. Not my casual neighborhood acquaintances. This was too bizarre, too personal. Then I remembered Lauren Mackenzie, a woman I'd met through a community garden project last year. She worked as a financial crimes investigator for the district attorney's office. We weren't close friends, but we'd had lunch a few times, bonding over our shared love of mystery novels. Would she think I was crazy if I reached out? Would she even talk to me outside of an official capacity? I found her contact in my phone and stared at it for a full minute before summoning the courage to make the call. "Elizabeth." "This is a surprise," Lauren answered, her voice warm but curious. "How have you been?" I took a deep breath. "Not great, actually. I need some advice, professional advice, but unofficially. It's complicated, and possibly criminal." There was a pause before Lauren replied, her tone shifting to something more measured. "That sounds serious. Why don't you tell me what's going on?" So I did, starting with finding the documents, and ending with the bizarre hospital scene that had unfolded just hours earlier. Lauren listened without interruption, and I could almost hear her taking mental notes. When I finally finished, the silence stretched between us for several seconds. "You were right to call me," she finally said, her voice deadly serious. What you're describing sounds like a combination of identity theft, forgery, financial elder abuse, ironically, with your mother-in-law as both perpetrator and claiming to be victim, and possibly insurance fraud, depending on what that hospital visit was really about. My chest tightened at having my fears confirmed by a professional. What should I do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Lauren didn't hesitate. Document everything. Don't confront her alone. And Elizabeth, protect yourself, first financially and physically. People who commit these kinds of elaborate financial crimes don't react well when they're exposed. Lauren explained that she couldn't officially investigate without a formal complaint, but she could guide me through the process of gathering evidence and securing my finances. First, check your credit report immediately, she advised. Then contact the 3 major credit bureaus to place a fraud alert on your accounts. Tomorrow morning, go to your bank, not the one you share accounts with Richard at, a different one, and open an account in your name only. You may need funds that she can't access. The practical advice helped calm my racing thoughts, giving me concrete steps to focus on. What about Richard? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since this began. How do I tell him his mother has been? I couldn't even finish the sentence. Lauren's voice softened slightly. That's the hardest part. Family fraud is complicated because of the emotional betrayal. But Elizabeth, you need to consider that Richard may already know some of what's happening. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. No, I said immediately. He wouldn't be part of this. He loves me. Even as I said it, doubt crept in. Did I really know what Richard knew or didn't know? Had I been naive about my husband as well as his mother? I hope you're right, Lauren said gently. But prepare yourself for all possibilities. People can compartmentalize, especially when it comes to family loyalty. She promised to meet me the next day to look at the evidence I'd gathered and help me determine next steps. And Elizabeth, consider staying somewhere else tonight if you can, just until we understand the full situation. After we hung up, I sat on our bed, the bed Richard and I had shared for 15 years, and tried to process Lauren's suggestion that my husband might be involved in his mother's schemes. It seemed impossible. Richard had always been loving, attentive when he was home, successful in his career but never obsessed with money. We lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Nothing in his behavior had suggested financial distress or dishonesty. But then again, I hadn't noticed Vivian's manipulation either, had I? I'd been blind to her machinations for years, accepting her increasing presence in our lives, her subtle undermining of my confidence, her helpful interventions in our finances. Had I been equally blind to changes in Richard Bafta? I decided I needed to see what was in Vivian's house before making any decisions about Richard. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the spare key, my phone for taking photos, and a small notebook. As I headed to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Just landed in Denver for my connection. Tried calling earlier. Everything okay? Mom mentioned you seemed stressed. My hands froze over the keyboard. What should I say? If I responded to normally, would he be suspicious when everything later came to light? If I hinted at problems, would he alert Vivian? I finally typed. Taking your mom to doctor appointment took longer than expected. Signal bad at hospital. Will call tonight. Vague but not alarming. It would buy me a few hours at least. Vivian's house was located in Oak Ridge Estates, an older but still prestigious neighborhood about 40 minutes from our suburb. As I drove, I tried to organize my thoughts about what to look for. Financial documents, mail, anything that might show where the money had gone or what she was planning. But a more uncomfortable question kept intruding. What if Richard really was involved? What would that mean for the past 15 years of my life? Had my entire marriage been built on deception? I pushed the thought away as I pulled into Vivian's driveway, focusing instead on the immediate task. The house looked as it always did, immaculately maintained, with perfectly trimmed hedges and seasonal flowers in the planters. No one would suspect that anything sinister could be happening behind its respectable facade. Using the key, I entered through the side door that led into the kitchen. The house was silent and still, with that peculiar emptiness of a space temporarily abandoned. I stood for a moment, listening for any signs that someone else might be there, cleaning service, perhaps, or a neighbor checking in. Nothing. Moving quietly despite being alone, I made my way to Vivian's home office. Unlike the rest of her house, which was traditional and formal, her office was surprisingly modern. Sleek desk, ergonomic chair, high-end computer setup. Richard had helped her create this space a few years ago, insisting that his mother needed to enter the digital age properly. I sat down at her computer, not expecting it to be accessible, but to my surprise, it wasn't password protected. Either Vivian was overconfident, or this computer wasn't where she kept her sensitive information. A quick search through her documents folder revealed nothing unusual: recipes, book club notes, correspondence with friends, but then I noticed a program in her taskbar that I recognized from my own work in real estate years ago: financial management software. Clicking on it, I found myself looking at a comprehensive overview of multiple accounts, properties, and investments, all meticulously categorized and tracked. The total assets displayed at the bottom of the screen made me gasp. $2.4 million. That was impossible. Vivian had always lived comfortably on her late husband's insurance and investments, but nothing that would generate that kind of wealth. Scrolling through the accounts, I saw familiar names: our joint account with Richard, our investment portfolio, the home equity line of credit on our house, alongside others I didn't recognize. Most disturbing was an account labeled RNE Future, with recent transfers into it, totaling the exact amount of our home equity loan, $175,000. Next to it was a notation: Tampa property closing costs and renovations. I frantically searched through more files, finding a folder labeled Florida Relocation. Inside were photos of a beautiful waterfront condo, correspondence with a real estate agent, and renovation plans with a projected completion date, just 2 months away. Another document caught my eye: a draft of a letter to Richard that sent ice through my veins. Darling, by the time you read this, the Tampa property will be ready. As we discussed, once the insurance matter is settled, you can join me there and finally be free of the letter cut off there, as if Vivian had been interrupted while writing it or hadn't yet decided how to phrase the rest. My hands shaking, I took photos of everything I could find: account numbers, transfer records, the letter draft, the property documents. Then, following some instinct I didn't quite understand, I checked the trash bin on her computer. It contained recently deleted emails between Vivian and someone using the email address rcaldwell_private@gmail.com, an address I had never seen before, but with my husband's name. The subject lines were cryptic: next steps, timeline adjustment, concerns. I tried to open them, but they had been permanently deleted. Just the subject lines remained in the deletion log. My heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, I moved from the computer to Vivian's elegant desk. The drawers were locked, but I remembered the small decorative box she kept on her bookshelf, the one with the Chinese design that had belonged to her grandmother. Sure enough, when I opened it, there was a tiny key inside, just as I'd seen her use in the past when she showed me old family photographs stored in the desk. The key worked, unlocking the center drawer to reveal a series of neatly labeled folders. One was titled simply, Elizabeth. Inside was a document that made my blood run cold: a psychological evaluation with my name on it, dated 3 months earlier, that I had never undergone. The evaluation, clearly fabricated, described me as suffering from increasing paranoia, delusional thinking, and financial irresponsibility. It detailed incidents that had never happened: times I had supposedly become disoriented while driving, episodes of unexplained anger, instances where I had misplaced significant sums of money. The document was on official-looking letterhead from a Dr. Samuel Thornton, complete with medical license number and signature. Was this real? Had this Dr. Thornton knowingly created a false report, or had Vivian somehow forged this too? And more importantly, what was she planning to use it for? As I continued searching, the pieces started falling into place with horrifying clarity. Another folder contained information about conservatorships, the legal process by which someone could be deemed incapable of managing their own affairs. Highlighted passages described how spouses or family members could petition for control over an individual's finances and medical decisions if they could prove mental incapacity. Next to this was a sticky note with a date just 1 week away and the notation: court filing ready. In that moment, Standing in Vivian's pristine office, with evidence of her plot laid out before me, I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just financial fraud. Vivian was systematically building a case to have me declared incompetent, giving her and possibly Richard complete control over my life. I needed to get out of there. I quickly photographed the fake psychological evaluation, the conservatorship research, and anything else that seemed relevant. As I was carefully returning the folders to their exact positions, I heard something that made my heart stop, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through me as I quickly closed and locked the desk drawer, returned the key to its hiding place, and shut down the computer. Who could be arriving? Vivian was supposed to be in the hospital. Could it be Richard, somehow back early from his trip, a neighbor? Or had Vivian somehow managed to leave the hospital already? Peering cautiously through the office blinds, I saw a car I didn't recognize, a black sedan with a man in a suit stepping out. He walked with the confidence of someone who belonged there, using a key to let himself in the front door. I heard the alarm system beep as he disarmed it, then his footsteps in the foyer. I was trapped in the office, with no way out except through the main part of the house. My mind raced. I could hide under the desk or in the closet, but if he came into the office, I would certainly be discovered. Instead, I made a split-second decision, grabbing my purse and walking boldly out of the office just as he entered the living room. Our eyes met, and for a moment we both froze in surprise. He recovered first. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand moving toward his pocket. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive-looking suit. I forced myself to appear calm, drawing on years of social training. "I'm Elizabeth Caldwell, Vivian's daughter-in-law," I said, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. "I'm picking up some things for her while she's in the hospital. Who are you?" The man's posture relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained suspicious. "Martin Rourke, Mrs. Caldwell's attorney." I wasn't aware anyone would be here today. An attorney? Was he part of whatever Vivian was planning? I maintained my composure, years of playing the perfect daughter-in-law finally serving a purpose. It was unexpected. Vivian had a cardiac episode this morning. The doctor wanted to keep her for observation. I gestured vaguely toward the stairs. She asked me to bring her some comfortable clothes and her medication. Rourke's expression softened slightly. "I wasn't informed about any health issues. Is it serious?" I shrugged, trying to appear appropriately concerned but not alarmed. "They're running tests. Probably just a precaution. At her age." I started moving toward the door, then paused as if just remembering something. "Oh, she mentioned you might be stopping by this week. Something about finalizing paperwork." It was a fishing expedition, and I held my breath waiting to see if he would bite. Rourke hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, we have some estate matters to conclude. Nothing that can't wait until she's feeling better." He glanced at his watch. "Please tell Vivian I came by and that I'll call her tomorrow to reschedule our meeting." I nodded, edging closer to the door. "Of course. I'm sure she'll appreciate that." As I reached for the doorknob, Rourke called after me, "Mrs. Caldwell." I turned, my heart in my throat. "Make sure you set the alarm when you leave. Vivian is very particular about security." Was there a hidden meaning in his words? A warning? I couldn't tell. "Always," I assured him with a smile that felt brittle on my face. Once in my car, I sat for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. That had been close to close, but I had escaped with evidence and without raising obvious suspicion. I checked the time, 4:30 p.m. Richard would be landing in San Francisco soon for his final connection to Seattle. The hospital would be serving dinner to patients, and I had decisions to make about where to go and what to do next. Lauren had suggested I not stay at home tonight, and after what I'd found, that advice seemed more important than ever. But where could I go that Vivian or Richard wouldn't think to look for me? I finally decided on the Hampton Inn, near the highway. Anonymous, convenient, and unlikely to be on anyone's radar. Using cash rather than a credit card that could be traced, I checked in under my maiden name, something I hadn't used in 15 years. The room was bland but clean, a neutral space where I could spread out the evidence I'd gathered and try to make sense of it all. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, I scrolled through the photos on my phone, organizing them into categories: financial fraud, the fake psychological evaluation, the Florida property, the conservatorship research. Each piece alone was disturbing. Together, they painted a picture of calculated malice that was almost incomprehensible. At 7 p.m., my phone rang. Richard. I stared at his name on the screen, still unsure what to believe about his involvement. Taking a deep breath, I answered. Hey, I said, trying to sound normal. How was your flight? Richard's voice came through, warm and familiar, as always. Long, boring, the usual. How did Mom's appointment go? Is everything okay? I hesitated. This was my chance to test the waters, to see if he would reveal anything. Actually, they admitted her for observation. Some concerns about her heart rhythm. I kept it vague, waiting to see if his response matched what he should know if he were innocent or if it revealed prior knowledge. Why didn't you call me right away? Richard sounded genuinely alarmed, with no hint of performance in his voice. Which hospital? Have you spoken to her doctors? What did they say? The questions came rapidly, his worry palpable. I felt a small loosening in my chest. If he was acting, he deserved an Academy Award. Methodist Memorial, I replied. Dr. Patel said it's precautionary. They're doing tests overnight. I paused, then added, she told me not to worry you during your meetings. Richard sighed heavily. That sounds like Mom, always. Putting my work first, there was a rustling sound, as if he was moving around his hotel room. I should fly back early. The client meetings tomorrow aren't critical. No, I interrupted, perhaps too quickly. Really, Richard, the doctor didn't seem overly concerned. And you know your mother, she'd be furious if you cut your trip short unnecessarily. I needed time to figure things out before he returned. Richard was quiet for a moment. You're right, he finally said, but I'll call her right now and check in myself. Can you text me her room number? My mind raced. I hadn't anticipated this. Vivian would certainly tell Richard that something was wrong with me, that I had behaved strangely. I'm not sure they've assigned her a permanent room yet, I said. She might still be in the cardiac care unit where they restrict calls. Why don't you try in the morning? It was a weak excuse, but the best I could manage on the spot. Richard seemed to accept this. Okay, first thing tomorrow. Then, are you all right? You sound tired. Was that innocent concern or subtle probing? I couldn't tell anymore. Just a long day, I said. I think I'll turn in early. We exchanged a few more pleasantries before ending the call, with Richard promising to let me know his updated return flight information the next day. As I set down my phone, I realized I was shaking. The conversation had seemed normal on the surface, but now I questioned every word, every inflection. Was Richard's concern genuine, or was he checking to see if I suspected anything? I simply couldn't tell. I spent the next several hours combing through the evidence, making notes, and preparing for my meeting with Lauren the next day. Around 11 p.m., my phone chimed with a text. Expecting Richard again, I was surprised to see it was from an unknown number. Mrs. Caldwell, this is Nurse Angela from Methodist Memorial. You asked me to contact you if anything changed with your Madelna. She's attempting to check herself out against medical advice. Thought you should know. My heart raced as I typed back. Thank you. Has she succeeded? The reply came quickly. Not yet. Doctor is trying to convince her to stay. She's insisting nothing is wrong with her heart. After all, tests came back normal, so the cardiac symptoms had been fake, just as I suspected. I asked Angela to keep me updated, assuring her I would come to the hospital in the morning. Then I turned off my phone completely. I couldn't risk Vivian or Richard tracking my location if things escalated. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay awake in the unfamiliar hotel room, my mind replaying 15 years of memories, reinterpreting them through this new, disturbing lens. Had Vivian always been planning this? Had she seen me as a threat from the beginning, someone to eventually eliminate from her son's life? Or had something changed, triggering this elaborate scheme? And most painful of all was Richard, a knowing participant, or another victim of his mother's manipulation. Morning brought no clarity, but at least it brought action. I met Lauren at a quiet cafe far from both my neighborhood and Vivian's, bringing copies of everything I'd discovered. Lauren's expression grew increasingly grave as she examined each piece of evidence. This is comprehensive, she finally said, looking up at me with concern in her eyes. Elizabeth, What we're seeing here goes beyond opportunistic fraud. This was meticulously planned over a long period. She pointed to the fake psychological evaluation. This alone is deeply troubling. Creating false medical documents is a serious crime, and the intended use makes it even more sinister. Do you think Richard is involved? I asked the question that had kept me awake all night. Lauren considered carefully before answering. The evidence is mixed. The email address suggests some communication between them. The letter draft implies his knowledge, but, she hesitated, it's also possible Vivian is manipulating perceptions on both sides, creating separate realities where each of you thinks the other is problematic. She leaned forward, her voice low but intense. What we need now is to secure your position legally before confronting either of them. I have a friend, Rebecca Chan, who specializes in elder law and financial abuse cases. She often works with victims in situations like yours. But I'm not elderly, I pointed out, confusion momentarily overriding my anxiety. Lauren smiled grimly. The irony, right? Vivian is using tools typically designed to protect vulnerable seniors to target you instead. Rebecca understands these mechanisms from both sides. She can help us build a counteroffensive. She checked her watch. I can call her now if you're comfortable with that. The sooner we get legal protection in place, the better. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settling over me. For days I had been reeling, reactive. Now I was finally taking control, building my own strategy instead of just discovering Vivian's. Rebecca agreed to see us immediately, rearranging her morning schedule after Lauren briefly explained the urgency of the situation. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, warm and welcoming despite the serious nature of her practice. Rebecca herself was a contrast to Lauren's intensity, soft-spoken, with a deliberate way of moving that immediately put me at ease. But as she reviewed my evidence, I saw the same sharpness in her eyes that Lauren had shown. This is extraordinarily calculated, she said, examining the fake psychological evaluation. The good news is that false documentation this extensive gives us clear grounds for immediate action. Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca outlined a protection plan. First, emergency financial separation, securing my personal assets and freezing joint accounts to prevent further theft. Second, legal documentation of the fraud, including affidavits from the real Dr. Thornton, confirming the psychological evaluation was fake. Third, restraining orders if necessary. And finally, building a case for criminal charges. The question, Rebecca said gently, is how you want to handle your husband in this process. We can proceed assuming his complicity, which would mean including him in any restraining orders, or we can move forward treating him as a potential second victim, which changes our approach significantly. I stared at my wedding ring, the familiar gold band that had symbolized trust and partnership for 15 years. I need to know, I said finally. Before I decide anything else, I need to know if Richard is part of this. Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then let's design a way to find out something that protects you, while giving him the opportunity to reveal his true position. Together, the three of us crafted a plan. I would return home, ostensibly to gather clothes for Vivian, who was still in the hospital. Richard would be arriving back that evening from his business trip. I would leave carefully selected evidence where he would find it, not everything, but enough to prompt a reaction. Based on that reaction, I would know how to proceed. Lauren insisted on coming with me, waiting in her car outside our house as backup while I went inside. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you text me one word now, and I'm calling the police immediately, she said as we parked in my driveway. The house looked exactly as I'd left it the day before, peaceful, ordinary, betraying nothing of the turmoil that had engulfed my life. Inside, I moved quickly, gathering the original documents I'd photographed from Vivian's desk in our home office. Along with bank statements showing unusual activity, I arranged them on the dining room table, with a note that simply said, "We need to talk about your mother. I'll be back at 7. Then, I packed a small bag with essentials and left, not knowing if I would ever return to this house as Richard's wife. I spent the afternoon in Rebecca's office, signing paperwork to freeze joint accounts and apply for temporary protective orders, just in case. Rebecca emphasized, "We won't file these unless necessary." but having them prepared saves critical time if things escalate. At 6:45 p.m., Lauren drove me back to my neighborhood, parking down the street with a clear view of my house. Richard's car was already in the driveway. He had returned early. "Remember," Lauren said as I prepared to walk to my house, clear, direct questions. Watch his body language as much as his words. "And if you feel threatened in any way, text now." I know. I finished for her. The short walk to my front door felt like miles. I could see lights on inside, Richard moving past windows. What would I find when I confronted him? A conspirator in his mother's schemes, a manipulated son unable to see his mother's true nature, or something in between. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted my key in the lock. This was the moment when I would finally discover the truth about the man I had built my life around, the man I had loved and trusted for 15 years, the man who might have been planning to declare me mentally incompetent and take everything from me. Richard was sitting at the dining room table when I entered, the documents spread out before him. He looked up as I closed the door behind me, his face pale and drawn in a way I'd never seen before. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice hoarse. "What is this? Where did you find these?" I remained standing, keeping distance between us, studying his expression for any sign of deception. "Your mother's desk," I said simply. "There's more, much more, including a fake psychological evaluation diagnosing me with paranoia and a draft letter about you joining her in Florida once the insurance matter is settled." I watched him carefully as I spoke, looking for recognition, guilt, or confusion. What I saw instead was shock transforming into horror, his face crumpling as the implications sank in. "This can't be real," he whispered, looking down at the papers again. "Mom wouldn't, she couldn't." But even as he denied it, I could see he was connecting dots, remembering incidents, conversations, suggestions from his mother that suddenly made sense in this new context. "The home equity loan," he said slowly. "She told me you wanted to use it for investment opportunities she had researched, that we had discussed it and you were excited about the potential returns." He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "You never mentioned it, but Mom said you were surprising me with your new financial acumen, that you wanted to prove yourself." I felt a rush of relief so profound my knees nearly buckled. Richard hadn't known. The confusion and pain in his eyes couldn't be faked. He was realizing, just as I had, that someone he trusted implicitly had betrayed him. "There's no investment," I said gently, moving closer to the table. "The money went to a property in Tampa. She's been planning to move there, possibly with you. After something happens to me." I hesitated, then asked the question that would tell me everything I needed to know about our future. "Richard, did you create a private email account to communicate with your mother about me? About concerns and next steps?" Richard's bewilderment appeared genuine. "What? No, I only have my work email and our shared personal account." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of distress I'd seen countless times during our marriage. "Concerns. Elizabeth, the only separate email account I have is for your birthday and Christmas presents. Mom helped me set it up years ago so I could communicate with stores without you seeing the confirmations in our shared email." The innocuous explanation hit me like a thunderbolt. Of course, Vivian would have access to that account. She had helped create it. Had she been using it to impersonate Richard? To create a paper trail of his supposed involvement? I moved around the table and sat beside him, close enough to see his eyes but not touching. "Richard, I need to know everything your mother has told you about me recently, especially anything concerning my behavior, mental health, or our finances." Over the next hour, a disturbing pattern emerged. For at least 2 years, Vivian had been subtly undermining me to Richard during his business trips, suggesting I seemed increasingly forgetful, mentioning concerns about my spending habits, implying I was keeping secrets. Each comment had been small enough that Richard hadn't worried much, especially given Vivian's insistence that she was handling it and didn't want to burden him while he was working. "She always framed it as protecting you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "saying you were under stress but too proud to admit it, that she was helping you manage things at home so you wouldn't feel overwhelmed." He looked at me, anguish in his eyes. "I believed her because she's my mother, because she's always taken care of us. I never imagined she would." He gestured helplessly at the evidence before us. Why would she do this? What was she planning? I took a deep breath, steeling myself to share my theory. I think she was setting up a situation where you would have control of all our assets through a conservatorship, while I would be declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. Eventually, something would happen to me, an accident, perhaps, or a suicide due to my mental illness, and you and she would inherit everything, including the life insurance she made you change to her name. The color drained from Richard's face as I spoke. When I mentioned the life insurance policy, he shook his head vehemently. I never changed your designation as beneficiary. Never. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking as he accessed his insurance account. There it was, the policy showing Vivian Caldwell as primary beneficiary, changed earlier that year. This is forged, he whispered. I never did this. He looked up at me, eyes wild with a mixture of guilt and fear. Elizabeth, what has she done? What was she going to do to you? The realization of how close we had come to disaster hung between us like a physical presence. Outside, my phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. Everything okay? I quickly replied yes. He didn't know, feeling a weight lift from my heart even as new complications arose. Richard and I were on the same side, but we now faced a formidable opponent who had spent years constructing an elaborate trap around us. We need a plan, Richard said, straightening up with new resolve. We need to confront her with all of this, get her to admit what she's done, and then, he trailed off. The magnitude of betrayal by his own mother momentarily overwhelming him. I touched his hand gently. I've already started working with some people who can help us. Financial crimes investigator and a lawyer who specializes in these situations. They're waiting to hear from me. Richard's eyes widened with admiration and something else, pride. You've been handling all this while I was away, while discovering that my mother was essentially plotting against you. I nodded, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline that had carried me through the past 2 days began to fade. I had to, I said simply. Once I understood what might be happening, I couldn't just wait and hope I was wrong. Richard pulled me into a tight embrace, the first physical contact between us since this nightmare began. I'm so sorry, he whispered against my hair. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you from her. I let myself lean into him for a moment, drawing strength from the familiar feel of him, before pulling back. We both missed the signs, I said, but now we need to focus on stopping whatever she's planning and securing our lives. I texted Lauren, asking her to join us. When she arrived minutes later, Richard greeted her with the determined focus I recognized from his professional life. Together, the three of us called Rebecca on speakerphone and began formulating a strategy for confronting Vivian. We need to approach this carefully, Rebecca cautioned. People who construct elaborate deceptions like this often have contingency plans. If she feels cornered, she may escalate. We decided that Richard would visit his mother at the hospital the next morning, acting as if everything was normal, to assess her current state of mind and plans. Meanwhile, Lauren, Rebecca, and I would prepare for a formal confrontation, with all the evidence organized and, if necessary, law enforcement on standby. That night, Richard and I stayed in our home, taking the precaution of changing all the locks Vivian had keys and setting up a temporary security camera at our front and back doors. As we prepared for bed, moving around each other with the careful politeness of strangers despite our 15 years together, Richard paused by the dresser, looking at a photo of himself with his mother from years ago. I don't understand, he said softly. When did she change? Or was she always capable of this and I just refused to see it? I had no answer for him. The Vivian I thought I knew had been a carefully constructed facade. What insight could I possibly offer into the real woman behind the mask? Morning came too quickly. Richard dressed carefully in the clothes he knew his mother approved of, part of our strategy to make her believe everything was normal. Remember, I said as he prepared to leave for the hospital, just gather information. Don't confront her yet. We need to understand what story she's created about why I haven't been to visit her. He nodded, his jaw set in determination. I won't let her manipulate me again, he promised. Not now that I know what to watch for. I hugged him tightly before he left. Suddenly afraid, Vivian had spent decades perfecting her influence over her son. Would a few days of awareness be enough to counter years of emotional conditioning? While Richard was at the hospital, I met with Rebecca to finalize our legal strategy. We had decided to pursue both criminal charges for the financial fraud and forgery, and a civil case to recover the stolen funds. The evidence is overwhelming, Rebecca assured me. The fake psychological evaluation alone is a serious crime. Add in the identity theft, the forged signatures on financial documents, and the apparent plot to have you declared incompetent, we have a very strong case. But even as she spoke, a nagging worry persisted. Evidence might win us a legal victory, but it couldn't erase the personal devastation. Richard would have to testify against his own mother. Our life savings had been plundered, and the trust that forms the foundation of any family had been shattered beyond repair. Richard returned from the hospital, looking shaken but resolved. She almost had me again, he admitted as we sat in Rebecca's office. The way she spoke about you, so concerned, so sympathetic, saying you'd been acting erratically at the hospital, that she was worried about your mental state. He shook his head in disbelief. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I might have believed her. She's convincing. He described how Vivian had woven a story about my increasingly unstable behavior, suggesting that the stress of our marriage and financial responsibilities was too much for my fragile constitution. She had even cried, expressing fear that I might do something drastic if not properly supervised. Did she mention anything about her plans to leave the hospital? I asked, remembering Nurse Angela's text about Vivian attempting to check herself out against medical advice. Richard nodded grimly. She's being discharged this afternoon. She wants me to bring her to our house so she can help take care of things while I'm processing my worry about you. The audacity of IT planning to return to the scene of her crimes, to continue her machinations under our roof, was breathtaking. That's not happening, Richard said firmly, anticipating my reaction. I told her I'd reserved a room for her at the residence inn near us. Said I thought she'd be more comfortable there with the hospital staff checking in. It was a clever deflection, buying us time while not raising her suspicions. With Vivian's discharge imminent, we accelerated our timeline. Rebecca had prepared all the necessary legal documents, restraining orders, police reports for the financial crimes, emergency petitions to freeze any remaining assets Vivian controlled. The confrontation should happen in a public place, she advised, somewhere with security cameras and witnesses, but also with enough privacy that you can speak freely. We settled on a private room at a restaurant near Rebecca's office for the following day. Richard would pick up Vivian from the residence inn, ostensibly for lunch with me, to clear the air about the hospital incident. That evening, as Richard and I prepared dinner in our kitchen, a mundane activity that now felt precious in its normalcy, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Answering cautiously, I was surprised to hear Martin Rourke, Vivian's attorney, on the line. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, his tone clipped and professional. I understand there may be some irregularities regarding your mother-in-law's financial activities. My hand tightened on the phone. How did he know we were investigating? Had Vivian somehow been alerted? I'm not sure what you're referring to, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as Richard watched me with concern. Let me be direct, Rourke continued. Mrs. Caldwell Sr. came to me 6 months ago with concerns about your mental health and its impact on family finances. She asked me to prepare conservatorship documents. My breath caught in my throat, confirmation of exactly what we had suspected. However, he continued, certain discrepancies in the documentation she provided raised red flags. I've been conducting my own quiet investigation. He paused. I believe you and your husband should be aware that I have declined to represent Mrs. Caldwell further in this matter. In fact, I have contacted the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee regarding my concerns. Relief flooded through me as I realized what he was saying. Vivian had lost her legal representation. More than that, her own attorney had become suspicious of her actions. Thank you for telling us, I said, gesturing frantically to Richard to pick up the extension so he could hear. May I ask what specifically prompted your concerns? Rourke hesitated before answering. Professional ethics prevent me from sharing certain details. However, I will say that documents purportedly signed by you contained inconsistencies that suggested forgery. When confronted, Mrs. Caldwell's explanation was unconvincing. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I understand you've retained Rebecca Chan. She's excellent. I've informed her office that I'm willing to provide a sworn statement if needed. After hanging up, Richard and I stared at each other in stunned silence. Even her own lawyer saw through her. Richard finally said, a mix of relief and renewed pain in his voice, "Who else did she try to involve in this?" It was a question that would haunt us through the restless night that followed. How far had Vivian's web of deception spread? Had she approached Richard's colleagues, our friends? How many people had she tried to convince that I was unstable, unreliable, untrustworthy? The scope of her betrayal seemed to grow with each new revelation, the damage extending beyond financial theft to the systematic destruction of my reputation and credibility. The day of the confrontation dawned clear and cold, the October sunlight deceptively cheerful against the fallen leaves in our yard. I dressed carefully conservative, professional clothing that projected stability and confidence, the opposite of the unstable woman Vivian had been portraying me as. Richard and I barely spoke as we prepared, both lost in our own thoughts about the conversation to come. Would Vivian admit what she had done? Would she show remorse? Or would she continue to deny everything, maintaining her deception until the very end? I wasn't sure which possibility I dreaded more. We arrived at the restaurant ahead of schedule, meeting Rebecca Lorin and a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit, who would be observing from a nearby table. The private dining room was equipped with a small recording device, legal in our state with one-party consent, which Richard had provided. "Remember," Rebecca cautioned as we took our places, "the goal is to get clear admissions about the financial transactions, the forged documents, and her intentions regarding the conservatorship. Try to keep emotion out of it as much as possible. Focus on facts, dates, specific actions, easy to say, almost impossible to do when confronting someone who had plotted so thoroughly against me." Richard left to pick up Vivian, returning 30 minutes later with his mother on his arm. She entered the room with perfect poise, dressed immaculately as always, showing no sign of her supposed heart condition. Her smile faltered only slightly when she saw me sitting with Rebecca and Lauren, recovering quickly as she assessed the situation. "Elizabeth, dear," she said warmly, as if nothing were amiss, "I'm so glad you felt up to joining us. Richard told me you've been having a difficult time." The insinuation was subtle but clear. She was maintaining her narrative of my instability even now. I felt Richard stiffen beside me but kept my expression neutral as Rebecca introduced herself and Lauren. "Before we order," Rebecca said pleasantly, "there are some matters we'd like to discuss." She opened a folder containing copies of the forged financial documents, the fake psychological evaluation, and statements from the bank showing the diverted funds. "Mrs. Caldwell, could you explain these transactions? Specifically, the $175,000 withdrawn from the home equity line of credit on the Caldwell's residence, transferred to an account under your sole control." Vivian's smile remained fixed, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the first stirrings of alarm. "There must be some mistake," she said smoothly. "Elizabeth asked me to help manage some investments while Richard was traveling. As a favor, to surprise him with her financial acumen." Richard leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mom, stop. We know that's not true. We know about the Tampa property. We know about the conservatorship you were planning. We know about the forged life insurance beneficiary change." With each statement, Vivian's carefully composed expression slipped further, the mask of the caring mother-in-law cracking to reveal glimpses of the calculating woman beneath. "Still," she rallied, turning to Richard with practiced maternal concern, "Darling, I was only trying to protect you. Elizabeth has been making increasingly erratic decisions." "The doctor confirmed." "This doctor," Lauren interrupted, sliding forward the fake psychological evaluation. "Dr. Samuel Thornton, who, when contacted, confirmed he has never met Elizabeth Caldwell and certainly never conducted this evaluation." The direct challenge to her fabrication seemed to catch Vivian off guard. For the first time since I'd known her, she appeared genuinely flustered, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. "There's been a misunderstanding," she insisted, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "I was acting in everyone's best interests. Richard, surely you can see that I've only ever wanted what's best for you, by stealing from us." Richard's voice cracked with emotion. "By forging Elizabeth's signature, by planning to have my wife declared incompetent. Vivian flinched at the rawness of his pain, but quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders as her expression hardened. You wouldn't understand, she said, an edge entering her voice. I built everything for you. I sacrificed everything. And then you brought her into our family, someone who doesn't appreciate what that means, who doesn't understand the Caldwell legacy. The mask was slipping further, revealing a bitterness and resentment I had never suspected lurked beneath her polished exterior. What about the life insurance policy? I asked quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time. What was the plan there, Vivian? Our eyes locked across the table, and in that moment, something shifted. Perhaps she realized the game was over, that we had too much evidence, too many witnesses, or perhaps she was simply tired of the charade. Whatever the reason, Vivian Caldwell finally showed her true self. Insurance policies pay out for all sorts of accidents, she said, her voice cold and precise. Unstable people have unfortunate accidents all the time: medication overdoses, car crashes, falls. The casual way she referenced my planned death sent ice through my veins. Richard made a choked sound beside me, as if the air had been punched from his lungs. Rebecca nodded subtly to someone behind us, and the detective approached our table. Vivian Caldwell, I'm Detective Santos with the Financial Crimes Unit. Based on the evidence presented and your statements, I'm placing you under arrest for multiple counts of forgery, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. As the detective recited Miranda rights, Vivian's expression underwent one final transformation from calculating predator to wounded victim. Richard, she pleaded, tears suddenly flooding her eyes. Don't let them do this. I'm your mother. Everything I did was for you. But Richard turned away, unable to look at the woman who had raised him, who had also betrayed everything he believed about family and love. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, financial forensics, and emotional reckonings. With Martin Rourke's testimony adding to our mountain of evidence, Vivian eventually accepted a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and a 5-year prison sentence. The missing funds were mostly recoverable. The Tampa property had to be sold, investments liquidated, accounts emptied, but the emotional damage wasn't so easily resolved. Richard attended therapy 3 times a week, trying to process the dual trauma of his mother's betrayal and the realization that he had unknowingly enabled her behavior for years. I had my own healing to do, rebuilding trust not just in my marriage but in my ability to recognize deception. 6 months after Vivian's arrest, Richard and I sat in our living room newly redecorated to remove all traces of Vivian's influence, discussing whether to attend her sentencing hearing the following week. I need to be there, Richard said quietly. Not for her, but for myself. To see it through to the end. I nodded, understanding his need for closure, even as I questioned whether true closure was possible with wounds this deep. What about you? He asked, reaching for my hand. Do you want to go? I considered the question carefully. Seeing Vivian again would be difficult, but there was a symmetry to witnessing the final legal consequence of what had begun in that hospital room 6 months earlier. Yes, I decided, I'll go. We'll face this together, just like everything else. Richard squeezed my hand, gratitude in his eyes. We were slowly finding our way back to each other, rebuilding our marriage on a foundation of painful honesty rather than comfortable assumptions. The trust that Vivian had nearly destroyed was growing again, stronger for having been tested. We had learned the hard way that real families built on truth, not manipulation, on support, not control, on love that empowers rather than possesses. In the quiet of our living room, watching the sunset paint the walls with warm light, I remembered something Vivian had said at our wedding reception, 15 years and a lifetime ago. Family takes care of family. That's the Caldwell way. She had meant it as a warning, a declaration of ownership and control disguised as affection. Richard and I were creating a new Caldwell way, now one based on genuine care, on protecting each other not from imagined threats but from real harm, even when that harm came from someone who should have loved us most. The morning of the sentencing hearing, I stood in front of my closet, considering what to wear for this final confrontation with Vivian Caldwell. I selected a simple blue dress, professional, dignified, but also somehow hopeful. As I fastened my necklace, I caught sight of my reflection and was struck by how different I looked from the woman who had frozen in shock in that hospital emergency room. My eyes were clearer now, my posture straighter. I had walked through fire and emerged, not unscathed, but undefeated, stronger. If you're listening to my story and recognizing patterns in your own life, subtle manipulations, unexplained financial discrepancies, isolation from friends or family, don't ignore those warning signs like I did for too long. Trust that shiver of unease when something doesn't feel right. Document everything, and know that asking for help isn't weakness, it's the first step toward reclaiming your power. My journey from that hospital room to this moment of rebuilding wasn't easy, but it taught me that the truth, however painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. What would you do if someone you trusted betrayed you so completely? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has helped you recognize something important in your own life, please share it with someone else who might need to hear it. Sometimes our hardest moments can become lifelines for others. Until next time, this is Elizabeth Caldwell, signing off from my newly peaceful home in Connecticut.